Tonight, we follow the trail of a lantern burning at the edge of the monastery fields. Its light is steady, but its flicker hides messages carried only by those who could read its rhythm. A beacon for some, a warning for others, its glow still lingers across centuries. We begin in motion, not memory. Night carries you through a high nave where incense still hangs in the air. Your steps echo on marble. On the walls, saints, vines, sons with careful faces. Below the altar, a hidden stair. You descend. In the small room, shelves, dust, and a wooden box with a brass lock worn smooth by many hands. The lid lifts. Inside are pages from long ago, notes by a midwife, a monk's marginal sketches, lists of herbs, signs, and prayers. They speak the same language in different ways. Balance, mercy, order, light. This story is not a fight. It is a listening. We listen to the quiet lives of healers who used simples and timing, who learned the moon like a friend. We listen to builders who set stone by number, who saw the world as a set of patterns that could hold the soul steady. The Vatican guarded faith. The Freemasons guarded craft. The mystics guarded breath. Sometimes they met in secret. Sometimes they met only in symbols. Rulers feared what they could not control, so names were given. Heresy, witch, lodge. Yet the body still needed care, and the spirit still needed form. As you drift deeper, we will not accuse or defend. We will trace lines. We will ask, what was shared, what was hidden, and what was simply human, our wish to mend pain and make meaning. Each chapter is a small lamp. Together they make a path through cathedrals and kitchens, through gardens and chambers, through bans and blessings. You will find recipes, rites, and signs. You will hear a rumor at midnight and a prayer at dawn. Rest easy. Truth arrives like sleep slow at first, then all at once. The night was deep in Rome, velvet shadows drawn across the courtyards of the Vatican, when a single lantern flickered in a small stone corridor. A hand, careful and reverent, slid a key into a brass lock. The door gave way to a hush of dust and parchment. A chamber that smelled of ink long dried and leather long cracked. Shelves leaned with the weight of centuries, and on one shelf, not at the front but tucked behind layers of official volumes, there rested a bundle tied with faded blue silk. The silk had once been bright, but time had pulled its color into dusk. Whoever bound the pages had known the importance of beauty even in secrecy. The knot was neat, the folds precise, the gesture tender, as though what lay inside was not dangerous, but beloved. Fingers brushed the silk, and in that instant, it felt as though the bundle itself sighed. Some objects seem alive with memory, carrying the weight of countless hands that have touched them before. The knot loosened, the silk slid away. Inside were pages filled with handwriting that trembled between two worlds. Latin prayers crossed with symbols of the square and compass. Herbal notes written in margins beside sketches of stars. A midwife's instructions tucked between psalms. Each leaf carried the tension of opposites, devotion and suspicion, obedience and rebellion, care and control. In the dim lantern light, the pages told a story without shouting it. They whispered, they suggested. They gave glimpses of lives lived in quiet defiance of simple categories. These were not the records of conspirators plotting against faith. They were the reflections of people trying to reconcile what they had been taught with what they had learned through the body, the earth, and the stars. Imagine the scribe who wrote them. Perhaps he was a monk assigned to copy sermons, and in the hours before dawn he slipped in a symbol that meant something only to him. Perhaps she was a midwife who had seen herbs work when prayers did not, and she folded her instructions into a psalter to protect them from being thrown to fire. Perhaps they were both. Perhaps they were many. To open the bundle was not to uncover proof of infiltration, but to touch the soft undercurrent of lives lived beneath decree. The Vatican declared what was permitted, and the people whispered what was needed. Somewhere in that meeting, the bundle was born. The chamber where it rested had its own silence. Walls thick with history pressed in. A single candle guttered. Outside, bells marked the hour, their sound heavy with centuries of repetition. Yet within the bundle there pulsed something freer. Sketches of moon phases, lists of herbs like rosemary and valerian, small notes on when to cut stone by the stars. Each fragment carried intention, the intention to heal, to build, to keep rhythm with the unseen. As the pages turned, the silence deepened into something almost sacred. not the silence of fear, but the silence of a pause before revelation. The air seemed to hum with memory. Each word, each mark of ink, was a bridge between two traditions. The church's hunger for order, and the mason's love of pattern. The healer's trust in the earth and the monk's trust in prayer. To linger with the bundle was to feel that nothing had ever been truly separate. Human beings have always woven faith and craft, ritual and remedy. The only difference lies in names, in who claims ownership, in who holds power to bless or ban. The bundle, with its blue silk, stood as quiet witness that knowledge never really disappears. It only changes shape, hiding until hands are ready again to touch it. And so, in the stillness of that hidden chamber, the bundle rested once more. The silk tied again. The key turned. The door closed. Yet the whisper of its presence remained, drifting like incense through the arches of the night, calling anyone who listens. There are truths the fire could not consume, stories the silence could not erase. They wait for you, beneath silk the color of dusk, asking to be remembered. Moonlight enters churches like a secret guest. Through high-stained windows, it falls in pale stripes across pews and marble floors. At night, when prayers are finished and voices stilled, the moonlight becomes the only choir. It hums without sound, reminding the stones that time flows in cycles, not in lines. The old healers watched this light with care. They knew the moon's phases the way sailors know the tides. A waxing moon promised growth. A waning moon signaled release. New moons offered a blank page. Full moons poured energy like overflowing cups. For midwives, the moon's rhythm shaped the timing of births. For herbalists, it guided when to gather leaves or roots. For builders, it revealed when to set stones so that light would fall just so, once a year, across an altar. The nave of a cathedral, grand and echoing, seemed to mirror the night sky itself. Columns rose like trunks of ancient trees. Arches bent like the arc of the heavens. In the stillness after Vespers, one could almost believe the entire building was a stone map of the stars. And perhaps it was. Masons drew their lines with compass and square, but their eyes lifted to constellations. Priests raised chalices under domes painted with heavens. Both knew the power of pattern. In small villages far from Rome, the moonlight was simpler but no less sacred. A midwife stepped into her garden under silver glow, gathering chamomile blossoms heavy with dew. She whispered blessings to the plants as she clipped them, thanking them for their gifts. She would brew them into teas for restless mothers, for infants who would not sleep. Her rituals blended prayer with practice, intention with remedy. If questioned, she would call it devotion. In truth, it was both faith and craft. Inside cathedrals, monks also watched the moon. Calendars of feast days followed lunar patterns, Easter's date shifting each year with the first full moon after equinox. To them, the moon was a servant of divine order, a clock set by God's hand. They wrote charts, traced phases, calculated eclipses. Their motives were different, but the language was the same: cycles, rhythms, patterns. At times, these worlds brushed together, not in confrontation but in quiet harmony. A monk might share moon calculations with a mason working late by candlelight, helping align a window so that Easter morning's sun would spill gold across the altar. A midwife might trade moon charts with a mason's wife, her notes tucked discreetly into a psalter. No one called it infiltration then. It was survival, cooperation, the simple act of living by the sky. Moonlight over the nave was soft yet insistent. It reminded all who saw it that authority can ban words but cannot ban the sky. The moon shines equally on pope and peasant, on lodge and cloister, on heretic and saint. Its glow is impartial, its rhythm eternal. To walk under its light is to step into a truth beyond decree. Life unfolds in cycles, and each cycle holds its own wisdom. So the nave became a meeting place not of people, but of symbols. Stone arches echoed the arc of constellations. Shadows crept like sundials. Candles flickered in rhythm with breath. And above all, the moon whispered, as it always has, "You are part of something larger, something ordered yet alive. Follow me, and you will find your rhythm." That rhythm carried through the lives of those who listened. Births timed with waxing moons, stones set when shadows fell true, remedies gathered when blossoms opened under silver light. Each act was a prayer, each prayer an act. The moon did not choose sides. It only illuminated, and in its glow, faith and craft found common ground. Thus, the question, did the Freemasons infiltrate the Vatican, becomes softer here. For what is infiltration when the moon itself crosses stained glass and garden gate alike? Perhaps the truth is simpler. Patterns belong to no one. They belong to the night, and to all who dare to look up. She kept it under her mattress, wrapped in linen like a secret child. The little book was not bound in leather, not gilded, not blessed. Its cover was plain wood, darkened by oil from years of handling. Yet to her it was more precious than any psalter. It was her almanac. The midwife had no schooling in Latin. Her letters were plain, her drawings rough. But every page breathed with knowledge learned through living. Tables of moon phases, sketches of herbs, notations of which prayers soothed frightened mothers, which songs calmed infants in the first hours of life. She wrote with blunt honesty. Use valerian when fear is strong. Do not give too much rosemary. Heart grows restless. Sing while boiling water. The child hears it. To open her almanac was to step into a woven world where body, spirit, and sky met seamlessly. She did not separate them. For her, a birth was both a physical ordeal and a sacred threshold. Herbs and prayers worked together. Moonlight and timing mattered as much as steady hands. Each birth entered into her book, not only as fact but as ritual, a repeating cycle that echoed the larger rhythms of creation. The church often distrusted such books. Too much emphasis on herbs seemed like heresy. Too much attention to moon cycles seemed like paganism. Too much reliance on the midwife instead of the priest threatened order. And yet, when the pains began, it was the midwife who was called, not the bishop. She entered homes quietly, her satchel filled with cloth, oils, and her little almanac. She brought not only remedies but calm, the kind of calm born of experience. In her presence, fear softened. The family trusted her, not because she wielded power, but because she listened. Listening was her craft. Listening to breath, to cries, to silence, to signs in the sky. At night, after long hours, she would sit by candlelight and add to her book, a symbol of the moon above a note. Child came early, waxed strong. A star beside another. Child weak, prayed long. She coded what she could, knowing eyes might one day pry. Yet she trusted that whoever needed the book would understand. In time, the almanac passed from hand to hand. A niece, then a neighbor, then another woman who carried on the work. Each added her own marks, her own remedies, her own notes on songs that soothed, herbs that healed, prayers that calmed. The book became a chorus of women's voices, low and steady, carrying across generations. For the Vatican, the danger lay not in the herbs themselves, but in the independence the book gave. Knowledge held outside clerical walls always feels like threat to authority. Yet the book survived, because need outweighed decree. Families trusted what worked, and what worked found its way into the almanac's pages. The question of Freemasons enters here in whispers. For among the pages appeared drawings of squares, compasses, and circles. Did the midwife learn them from a Mason neighbor, or did she invent them as her own shorthand for cycles and balance? We cannot know. What matters is that her language of healing mirrored their language of craft. Measure, rhythm, proportion, order. Not infiltration, but resonance. Different lives, same truth. Her book, humble and worn, became more than record. It was a testimony that knowledge survives when it meets need. Bans, trials, condemnations, all of these fade when a mother cries out in pain and someone comes with herbs, prayers, and steady hands. The almanac was her way of saying, life continues, and here is how. As moonlight brushed her table, as the candle guttered low, she wrote once more, another birth, another cycle. The ink dried, the page turned, the book thickened with years, and always she wrapped it again in linen, placed it under her mattress, and rested. Her sleep was never easy, but it was certain. She had done her work, and the book would outlive her. Thus the midwife's almanac endures not as proof of heresy, but as proof of care. It shows that beneath decrees and suspicions, ordinary people preserved what mattered most. The knowledge that heals, the rhythms that guide, the faith that comforts. And so the little book, worn smooth, continues to whisper across time, reminding us that truth does not vanish, it is kept, like a child in linen, until it is safe to be seen again. In the still hush of a village kitchen, before dawn had cracked the horizon, a woman reached for her basket and slipped quietly out the back door. The world was blue-gray, dew silvering the grass, the moon retreating toward rest. Her feet knew the path without light, leading to the small patch of earth she called her ladder. Not a ladder of wood, not one climbing into rafters or trees, but a ladder of herbs rising in order, each plant a step toward healing. The first step was chamomile, its blossoms soft as small suns, coaxing sleep and easing the restless. She knelt, touched its petals, whispered a prayer of thanks, then plucked carefully. Chamomile was for infants too unsettled to close their eyes, for mothers too troubled to rest, for old men whose aches kept them awake. A small tea, a gentle word, and night could soften again. The second step was sage. Sharp on the tongue, smoky on the air when burned, sage cleared heaviness from rooms. She dried its leaves to hang above doorways, ground it to powder for poultices. When grief lingered too long in a house, she brought sage to sweep it clean. The church called incense holy. She called sage the same. The difference was only in name, not in effect. The third step was valerian. Strong, musky, almost unpleasant in scent, but unmatched in power. Valerian soothed hearts racing with fear, pulled sleep down over minds churning with thought. She kept its root carefully, knowing too much could overwhelm. Too little could do nothing. Balance was the secret, the art of exact measure. The fourth step was rosemary, bright and fragrant, needles holding the memory of the sea. Rosemary sharpened the mind, lifted spirits, clouded by despair. She set sprigs in pillows, placed branches at graves. For the living, it brought clarity. For the dead, it brought remembrance. The fifth step was lavender, a purple hush against the green. Its scent carried peace. Its oil calmed restless children and weary mothers. She scattered it in bathwater, pressed it into cloth sachets, tucked it under pillows. Lavender was the bridge between the body and the dream. The sixth step was thyme, tiny leaves carrying the strength of courage. Soldiers carried it into battle. Mothers brewed it for children sick with fever. Its taste was sharp, its power hidden in size. She respected it deeply. The seventh step, her crown, was yarrow. White blooms clustered like stars, guiding her through wounds and bleeding. She wrapped its leaves to staunch cuts, boiled them for fever, offered them as symbol of resilience. Yarrow, she knew, was both shield and key. This was her herbal ladder, 7 steps of care ascending toward balance. Each rung was a plant, each plant a note, together forming a song that spoke to the body in its own tongue. To her, this ladder was as holy as any psalm, for it was made of God's earth and answered the cries of his children. The ladder was not written in any official book. It was passed in hands, whispered in kitchens, grown in gardens behind stone walls. The Vatican did not bless it, yet people turned to it when need came, because it worked. The midwife, the healer, the herbalist, they climbed this ladder in silence, unseen but essential. Some accused them of sorcery. Others defended them as mere women with gardens. But those who had felt chamomile ease a fever, lavender hush a restless night, or yarrow staunch a wound knew truth could not be burned or banned. The latter was part of the body's memory, as natural as breath. By night, she would copy her notes into small slips of parchment, a circle for chamomile, a wave for sage, a root for valerian. She wrote in symbols, safe from suspicion, but clear enough for those who knew. These slips traveled into satchels, into pockets, into hidden corners of psalters. They traveled farther than she ever did, climbing invisible ladders into other lives. In cathedrals, priests lifted chalices and blessed incense. In lodges, masons measured stone with compass and square. In cottages, women touched herbs and whispered prayers. Each group sought order, healing, meaning. Each climbed ladders of their own making, yet all ladders rose toward the same sky. The herbal ladder endures as memory not because it was hidden well, but because it was needed deeply. People do not forget what heals them. They pass it on, even when names change, even when bans are posted. The ladder of herbs still stands in gardens today, each step familiar, each plant waiting, each prayer alive in the scent of crushed leaves. Stones remember in silence. They carry the marks of chisels, the weight of scaffolds, the sweat of builders who shaped them. Each block lifted into a wall holds more than matter. It holds intention, rhythm, design. And when stones rise into arches and domes, they become scripture in form, sermons in shape. In the heart of a great cathedral, stone and scripture met seamlessly. A mason drew lines with his compass on rough-hewn slabs, tracing arcs that would become windows and vaults. His eye sought balance, his hand measured proportion. He whispered psalms as he worked, not out of obligation, but because rhythm steadied his craft. Scripture entered his stonework not as command, but as song. The church saw scripture as written word, bound in books, guarded by priests. The masons saw scripture as geometry, the language by which God wrote creation. To them, a circle was more than form, it was eternity. A square was more than measure, it was stability. A triangle pointed both upward and downward, linking heaven and earth. They carved these shapes into chapels not to infiltrate faith, but to express it in their own tongue. One night, under torchlight, a mason and a monk shared a quiet meal after hours of labor. The monk spoke of a passage from Genesis, how God measured the heavens and laid the foundations of the earth. The mason nodded and smiled, saying he too measured, laying foundations, shaping arches to hold weight. Both spoke of creation, one in scripture, one in stone. They were not enemies. They were mirrors. Whispers later would claim Masons infiltrated the Vatican, hiding symbols in walls and floors. But the truth is simpler. The Masons were the builders of the Vatican. Their tools were their scripture. Their scripture became the Vatican itself. Every arch, every dome, every column was a verse written in stone, echoing the words monks copied by candlelight. Stones outlast parchment. While books could be burned, walls remained. The geometry carved into capitals, the rose windows aligned with solstice light, the mosaics that mirrored stars, these became scriptures no decree could erase. The Vatican guarded word, the Masons guarded form. Together they built cathedrals that still breathe centuries later. And so, stone and scripture intertwine. Each stone laid is a prayer. Each verse sung is a pattern. Faith does not live only in ink. It lives in arches that hold silence, in walls that carry echo, in floors that bear the weight of millions of steps. The Masons and the monks knew this truth, though they spoke it differently. What outsiders later called infiltration may simply have been collaboration, each side leaning into the other, stone holding scripture, scripture guiding stone. The cathedrals that rise still today bear witness. Light through rose windows, sound in vaulted naves, silence in crypts, all are scripture, all are stone. In a dim cloister, a scribe bent over his desk, quill scratching across parchment. He copied lines of psalms, word by word, his hand steady though his eyes blurred. Hours stretched into years in this task. Yet in the margins, where the abbot's eyes seldom strayed, he left small marks, circles, stars, squares, sometimes suns with smiling faces, sometimes moons with hidden crescents. These circles were not errors. They were not decorations alone. They were signs, fragments of a language whispered between those who knew. To some, they marked reminders of feast days. To others, they hinted at cycles of the moon. To yet others, they were emblems of balance, unity, eternity. When a midwife received such a manuscript, she saw not only scripture but a chart of timing. The circle told her when to gather herbs, when to expect births, when to pray for strength. When a mason glimpsed the same page, he saw templates for arches and domes. When a priest read it, he saw devotion to God's perfection, expressed in form. Each eye found meaning, and none contradicted the other. The Vatican might have frowned, might have called such marks heresy or infiltration. Yet the marks remained because they were small, silent, unthreatening. Margins gave freedom. In margins, truth survived. These circles connected people who never met. A scribe in one monastery left a symbol that echoed in the practice of a healer miles away. A mason tracing a compass line felt kinship with a symbol he once saw in a psalter margin. The symbols were bridges, carrying meaning across boundaries of rank and role. Over time, whispers grew. Masons marking scripture, healers writing codes, monks smuggling symbols. But perhaps it was simpler still. Circles appear wherever humans seek eternity. Stars appear wherever humans look up at night. Squares appear wherever humans build. The margins were not infiltration. They were humanity's natural impulse to draw meaning. Imagine a reader centuries later, turning the crackling pages and pausing at a small sun drawn beside a psalm. He wonders, was this secret code? Or was it a scribe's quiet joy? A simple act of leaving his own light in the shadows of duty? The answer may be both. Symbols carry as much as we give them, and so the circles in the margins endure. They are whispers that cannot be silenced, reminders that even within rigid lines, space for wonder remains. Margins are freedom, circles are eternity, and meaning lives where ink touches paper in ways no authority can fully contain. The hall was quiet when the doors closed. Torches lined the walls, their flames wavering in small sighs of smoke. A circle of men stood together, robes heavy with age, hands pressed to their chests. In the shadows of the room, a monk watched silently. At first glance, it seemed no different from a mass. Solemn words spoken, gestures repeated. Yet there was a difference in tone, a private rhythm in the cadence of their voices. They were taking an oath. Oaths have always lived close to blessings. A vow before God and a vow before a brotherhood share the same root words made sacred by intention. The monk listening knew this. He himself had sworn vows of obedience, poverty, chastity. His life was tied by promises that could not be broken without consequence. So when he heard words spoken by builders, words binding them to secrecy and loyalty, he did not hear danger. He heard something familiar, the same trembling weight he carried in his own heart. The difference was in who received the words. In the chapel, vows rose to God. In the lodge, they rose to each other. Both reached upward, both carried weight. An oath is a bridge, a thread spun between what is said and what must be lived. To break it is to break more than trust. It is to break the fabric of belonging. The Vatican feared oaths outside its walls. It feared promises stronger than papal decrees, loyalties that could not be controlled. But those who took such oaths did not see them as rebellion. They saw them as anchors. A mason's work was dangerous. Walls could crumble, scaffolds could fall. Without loyalty, without trust, lives were at risk. Their oaths were survival. The monk, returning to his cell that night, considered his own vows. Had he not promised to remain faithful even in silence, even in secrecy? His vows bound him to God, but they also bound him to his brothers, to the rhythm of their lives. The line between oath and blessing blurred until he could no longer separate them. Perhaps there was no need to. Blessings, too, carried weight. When a priest lifted his hand and spoke words over the sick, he called on grace to move through him. When a healer whispered over a cup of water steeped with herbs, she called on the same grace, though her words were humbler, simpler. The Vatican claimed one was holy, the other dangerous, but for those who received them, both brought peace. Both soothed fear. Both carried power. Imagine a woman in childbirth. The midwife by her side murmurs a blessing as she lays cloth across her brow. Outside, a priest prays for the safety of her soul. Both words rise into the night. Which carries more weight, the one spoken in Latin within stone walls, or the one spoken in plain speech by the bed where sweat and tears flow? The woman does not care. She hears both as hope. Oaths and blessings are cousins. Both are breath turned into bond. Both shape reality through sound. To swear, to bless, is to carve truth into the air, to declare that what is spoken shall be so. The Masons, the monks, the healers, all knew this. Their lives revolved around words that bound, words that guided, words that shaped. Later, whispers spoke of infiltration. They said the Vatican feared oaths of Masons, secret blessings outside its reach. But perhaps the truth is simpler. The Church feared competition in the realm of the spoken sacred. To control words is to control power. Yet words are like seeds. Once scattered, they grow in many places. The monk who heard that oath never reported it. He returned to his prayers, to his vows, to his own blessings. Perhaps he understood what others did not, that oaths and blessings are not thefts, but reflections. Each one is an attempt to hold life steady in a world that trembles. Each one is a hand reaching out in the dark, promising that something larger than fear binds us together. In the end, an oath is not so different from a blessing. Both are lamps lit against the night. Both whisper the same truth. You are not alone. The village square smelled of ash. Charred wood still smoldered, thin wisps curling into the night air. A pile of blackened pages lay at the center, their edges glowing faintly. Children watched from doorways, silent, wide-eyed. The elders shook their heads but said nothing. To speak would be dangerous. To remember was safer done in silence. The books that burned were not Bibles. They were small collections, herbals, journals, almanacs, pages filled with notes on healing, with recipes for teas and poultices, with sketches of moons and stars. To the inquisitors, these pages looked dangerous. To the villagers, they were survival. But fire has no ears. Fire consumes without care. The smell of smoke carried more than burned paper. It carried fear. For those who had written the notes, for those who had relied on them, the fire said, "Your knowledge is not safe. Your memory is not welcome." Yet fire cannot erase what lives in bodies. A midwife still remembered chamomile calms. A mason still remembered stars guide arches. A healer still remembered which root to boil for fever. The smoke rose, but the memory remained, tucked into breath, into practice, into silence. At night, after the flames died, women gathered in kitchens. They spoke softly, passing knowledge from lips to ears. They wrote again, this time smaller, hidden, folded into prayer books. The smell of smoke lingered, but so did the scent of dried lavender and sachets, sage in kitchens, rosemary in bread. Life continued. In the Vatican halls, the same smoke meant triumph. Dangerous words had been erased. The church could rest easier. But smoke lies. It gives the illusion of ending when in truth it spreads. The fire had scattered seeds. For each book lost, another memory awoke. For each page burned, another story was spoken aloud. The mason, sharpening his chisel by firelight, remembered lines he once saw in a burned book. He scratched them into stone, hiding them in a pattern on a chapel wall. The midwife, who lost her grandmother's almanac to flames, rewrote its lessons in lullabies, songs sung softly at cradles. Children learned the words without knowing their deeper meaning, carrying them into adulthood. The healer pressed symbols into embroidery, into borders of cloth, into corners of linens. Smoke could not touch thread. The smell of smoke became a teacher. It taught caution. It taught secrecy. It taught resilience. Those who survived the burning learned to hide wisdom in plain sight. They folded remedies into recipes, prayers into songs, symbols into margins. The smoke had tried to erase them, but it only forced them to become more subtle, more enduring. And so the smell of smoke drifted not only as fear but as reminder. Knowledge is fragile, yet persistent. Fire destroys pages but cannot burn memory. Ash settles, but seeds sprout. The smell of smoke lingers, but beneath it, the scent of herbs grows strong again, filling rooms, soothing fears, guiding hands. What some later called infiltration may have been nothing more than survival. Knowledge tucked into stone, into song, into symbol, not to defy the church, but to preserve life. The Vatican burned books, the people kept living. The smoke lifted into the night, but the truth remained, carried quietly in hearts, in hands, in silence. The letter was written in careful Latin, its script neat and measured. It carried the weight of authority, sealed with wax, signed with flourish. It did not shout, it did not rage, it simply warned. A quiet reprimand. Such letters were common in the Vatican's reach. They addressed practices deemed questionable: too much interest in herbs, too much talk of stars, too many whispered gatherings outside church walls. The reprimands did not accuse outright. They reminded. They advised caution. They spoke of dangers to the soul. Their tone was paternal, their intent clear. You are being watched. For those who received them, the effect was chilling. A healer opening such a letter felt her hands tremble. A mason, who saw his guild named in cautionary words, felt his chest tighten. A monk whose margins had been noticed bowed his head in silence. The reprimand was not a trial. Not yet. But it was a shadow. A warning that eyes had turned toward them. Yet the reprimand was also an opening. It was not fire, not chains. It left space for adjustment, for silence, for retreat. Many learned to read these letters as thresholds. Step too far, and the fire would come. Step carefully, and the work might continue. The reprimand drew lines, and survival meant learning to walk between them. A midwife once showed her reprimand to her daughter. She traced the words slowly, explaining, "This is how they remind us they hold power. But we still hold life. We do not stop. We move quieter. We move gentler." She folded the letter and tucked it away. Not destroyed, not displayed. A reminder. The mason, reprimanded for symbols carved too boldly, learned to soften his hand. His circles became floral motifs. His stars became decorative flourishes. The reprimand taught him to disguise. The work continued, hidden within beauty. The monk, whose margins carried too many suns, received his reprimand in silence. He bowed, apologized, and then began to hide his symbols deeper in the texts, within initial letters, within flourishes, within subtle strokes. The reprimand taught him craft. His light still shone, just hidden from easy eyes. Quiet reprimands built a culture of resilience. They forced wisdom underground, but underground roots grow strong. They taught subtlety, taught patience, taught endurance. Knowledge became like water, flowing around obstacles, shaping stone without force. Later accusations of infiltration missed this nuance. They imagined conspiracies, secret rebellions. But the truth was softer. It was adaptation. The reprimands pressed down, and the people bent, not to break, but to survive. Their knowledge did not vanish. It whispered instead, moving beneath notice, waiting for those who could hear. The reprimand was meant to silence. Instead, it became a teacher. It taught the art of quiet persistence, of hiding truth in plain sight, of disguising eternity as decoration. And so, in the long corridors of history, the reprimands still echo not as victories of control, but as evidence of the resilience of those who received them. The reprimand whispers even now. Bend, do not break. Hide, but do not forget. Speak softly, but keep speaking. The key was heavy, cold, iron, worn smooth, where countless fingers had gripped it. It hung from a ring at the belt of a man who moved through the Vatican's corridors in silence, unlocking and locking doors with the patience of habit. Each turn of the key made a hollow sound that echoed like a small bell in the stone halls. Keys meant power. They meant control over who could enter and who must remain outside. In these corridors, access was everything. But not all keys were iron. Some were flesh. A healer's hands were keys too, unlocking relief in a fevered brow, opening passage for new life during birth, turning the lock of despair into something softer, more bearable. While one man carried iron at his side, another woman carried keys in her fingers, in her ability to touch and soothe, to unlock peace where pain had shut the door. The Vatican's guardians feared the wrong keys. They feared the iron might be stolen, the locks broken. Yet it was never the iron that threatened them. It was the hands. Hands that carried knowledge not written in their books. Hands that knew pressure points, herbs, rhythms of breath. Hands that touched lives in ways no decree could stop. A midwife, called to a cottage at night, carried no keys of iron. She carried cloth, herbs, and her touch. She entered homes freely, trusted to open the locked gates of suffering. In her hands lay more power than any guard at the Vatican's door. Her touch turned pain to release, fear to calm, death to survival. The family never questioned who held the greater key. In the Masons' lodge, hands worked as keys too. They held chisels, mallets, compasses. A block of stone, silent and useless, became doorway and window under those hands. Each strike unlocked potential hidden in the stone. Their tools were keys to shape, their skill the hand that turned them. The Vatican might bless a finished church, but it was the Masons' hands that truly opened the building to light and air. So the world lived in paradox. Keys of iron clanged on belts and gave the illusion of control. Hands of flesh moved quietly, opening doors no iron could touch. The church locked archives, but people still healed each other. The church guarded gates, but masons still raised walls that carried sound toward heaven. The church feared infiltration, but hands passed secrets with a touch, no key needed. One evening, a scribe wrote of his doubt. He copied psalms with precision, but in the margin he noted, "What is the difference between a priest's blessing and a healer's hand? Both open." His note was not bold, but the thought lingered. He too saw keys beyond iron. Keys and hands teach a truth. Authority lives not only in locks but in touch. The iron keys will rust, the locks will change. But hands remain, passing knowledge, unlocking comfort, shaping stone, healing wounds. To trust only in iron is to forget the greater power of touch. And so history remembers both the clang of keys in corridors and the quiet miracle of hands working in shadow. Perhaps the real infiltration was not one of secret societies, but of hands that never stopped unlocking life, even when the iron keys tried to shut every door. The bell rang at dawn. Its deep voice rolled across the rooftops, through courtyards, into kitchens where bread was kneaded and prayers were whispered. The bell marked time, summoning monks to chant, calling villagers to mass, reminding the world that life moved in sacred rhythm. Far from the bell tower, in a half-built cathedral, another rhythm echoed. A hammer struck stone, steady, sure, echoing like a second bell. Tap, pause, strike. Dust fell from the chisel's edge as blocks shaped into arches. To a passerby, the sound was ordinary labor. To the mason, it was music. The hammer kept time as faithfully as the bell. The Vatican claimed the bell as its voice. It told the people when to wake, when to pray, when to gather. But the hammer had its own voice, one that shaped the very spaces where the bell could be heard. Without the hammer, the bell tower would not stand. Without the mason's rhythm, the church's rhythm would fall silent. The two sounds blended in cities, bell above, hammer below. Together they told the story of order. Faith and craft working in tandem, even if neither wished to admit dependence. Children grew hearing both. They knew the bell meant prayer, the hammer meant bread. Their fathers worked the stone, their mothers lit candles. The rhythms overlapped, weaving together like strands of rope. It was not infiltration. It was coexistence, unavoidable and natural. At night, when the bells were silent, hammers often still rang faintly as masons worked by torchlight to finish what daylight had not allowed. Their rhythm continued the day's music. The sound slipped into dreams, steady and reassuring. It said, "The work is being done, the world is being built, tomorrow will stand." The bell marked sacred hours, but so did the hammer. One called souls to prayer, the other called stone to rise. Both carried authority, both demanded respect, but the Vatican acknowledged only the bell. The hammer was too humble, too earthly. Yet the hammer built the walls that carried the echo of the bell itself. Later, whispers grew. Did masons hide their symbols in stone? Did they weave secret meaning into the hammer's strikes? Perhaps. Or perhaps the symbols were nothing more than reflections of rhythm, of a desire to find harmony between matter and spirit. For a mason, each strike of the hammer was prayer, each line drawn by compass devotion. Their language was not rebellion, but reverence, spoken in stone rather than scripture. The people heard both bell and hammer, and in their hearts, they knew both were holy. In the heart of many cathedrals lies a stair no one sees. It curls behind walls, narrow and dark, built for workers to climb unseen as they repaired roofs or tended bells. To the faithful gathered in the nave, the stair did not exist. They saw only grandeur, but hidden within that grandeur, the stair wound its way like a secret artery. The hidden stair was built by masons who knew that beauty needs support, that miracles of architecture require unseen labor. It was not made to deceive, it was made to serve. Yet over time, it took on a life of its own in imagination. People whispered of passages used for secret meetings, of hidden steps where forbidden knowledge passed from hand to hand. In truth, it was often only dust, narrow treads, and the smell of stone. Still, the stair symbolized something powerful. It reminded those who knew of it that behind every public truth lies a private path. The Vatican displayed majesty in open spaces, But behind the walls, hidden stairs carried the weight of reality. A monk once climbed such a stair at night, candle in hand. He paused halfway, hearing the echo of his own breath. He realized the stair was more than stone. It was metaphor. Each step downward was descent into the hidden, into the layers beneath surface faith. Each step upward was ascent toward revelation, toward light at the top. To climb the hidden stair was to live between seen and unseen, public and private. Decree and practice. The Masons built these stairs without thought of infiltration, yet they became symbols for it. To those who feared secrecy, every hidden passage hinted at conspiracy. To those who lived them, they were simply the way things worked. You build beauty with what is visible. You sustain it with what is not. The midwives, too, had hidden stairs, though theirs were not of stone. They were paths of knowledge passed quietly. One woman to another, unseen by bishops but vital for survival. Their stairs wound through memory, not mortar. The steps were remedies, prayers, timing, all tucked into silence, yet always ready to be climbed when needed. So the hidden stair exists everywhere, in cathedrals, in cottages, in archives, in memory. It is the unseen work that sustains the seen world. The Vatican feared these unseen paths, calling them infiltration. But perhaps the truth is gentler. All life has hidden stairs. Without them, the grand halls would crumble, the rituals would falter, the world would lose its balance. To walk a hidden stair is to remember, not all truths are on display. Some truths live in shadow, carrying us upward and downward, step by step, until we arrive at the places where light pours in. The baker woke before the bells. He stepped into his stone kitchen, the air cool and damp, his hands already dusted white with flour. He moved in silence, kneading dough as the first hints of light touched the rooftops. Bread rose under his fingers, soft and alive. A quiet miracle repeated daily. He thought of little else while he worked: flour, water, yeast, time. Yet in his rhythm lay something deeper, something mirrored in the healers who prepared their balms. Both bread and balm demanded patience. Yeast needed darkness and warmth to rise. Herbs needed slow boiling to release their essence. Bread fed the body, balm soothed it. The baker and the healer worked in different rooms, yet their crafts were kin. They both transformed the raw into the nourishing, the bitter into the gentle. Their work was quiet, but it carried survival. In the Vatican halls, bread was lifted during Mass, blessed and broken as symbol. In cottages, bread was baked in small ovens, eaten with gratitude as sustenance. Balm, too, carried dual meaning. Priests anointed with holy oils. Healers rubbed oils into skin to calm fever or mend wounds. The line between sacred and ordinary blurred until it vanished. The people who ate and healed did not care where the blessing came from, so long as hunger and pain were eased. The baker's hands, pressing dough, moved like prayer. He folded and stretched, whispering to himself that the bread would rise. In another house, a midwife pressed balm into the cracked skin of a mother's hands, whispering words of comfort. Fold and press, fold and press. The two crafts echoed one another, like verses from the same hymn sung in different languages. There were times of scarcity, when wheat was thin and herbs scarce. Then bread was stretched with barley or chestnuts, and balm was made from what grew by the roadside. Scarcity taught creativity. It also taught that comfort was more than abundance. A small loaf shared, a small jar of balm spread carefully, became more precious than plenty. The people remembered these acts long after the loaves were eaten, long after the balm was used. Whispers of infiltration often missed these simple truths. Did Masons carve symbols in cathedrals? Did healers hide recipes in psalters? Perhaps, but their daily life was simpler. Feed, soothe, comfort, mend. Bread, rising in darkness. Balm steeping in silence. If infiltration existed, it was not grand conspiracy, but the quiet insistence that ordinary life was sacred. One winter, the baker's daughter fell ill. He stayed by her bed, helpless as fever raged. The priest came with prayers, laying hands on her forehead. The midwife came with balm, massaging her chest with oils of thyme and rosemary. The baker sat between them, praying and hoping. His daughter slept, her breath deepened, and by dawn the fever broke. He thanked both priest and midwife, not distinguishing which had saved her. For him, bread and balm, prayer and touch worked together. Years later, when the baker built his oven anew, he asked a mason to carve a small circle on its arch. The mason obliged, chisel tapping, leaving a mark no one else would notice. The baker saw it as a blessing, a reminder that bread was more than food. It was life, and life needed both blessing and balm. And so, bread and balm remained intertwined. They fed, they healed. They reminded the people that comfort comes in many forms. Perhaps the Vatican feared infiltration because it mistook these simple truths for threats. But bread does not conspire. Balm does not rebel. They simply do what they were made to do. Nourish, soothe, sustain. And in their quiet persistence, they carry a deeper power than decree. The mason sat at his bench long after the workday ended, a single candle flickering beside him. The wax dripped slowly, pooling at its base, casting shadows across his tools. In the dim light, he opened his compass and traced arcs across a scrap of parchment. The lines glowed faintly in the candle's halo, perfect curves drawn by steady hand. By day, the compass was a tool of labor, measuring stone, aligning walls. By night, it became something more, a key to understanding order itself. With each circle, he felt he was not just designing, but listening to a language written in shape, a rhythm older than scripture. The circle whispered eternity. The square murmured stability. The triangle sang of balance. The candlelight made the lines shimmer, alive as though the compass itself carried a secret pulse. He worked not to conspire, but to align, to place his own small marks within a pattern that already existed in stars and seasons. He knew the Vatican's suspicion, the whispers that Masons hid secret codes in stone. Yet what he sought was not rebellion, but harmony. If he carved a circle into a window, it was because the circle was already written in the heavens. The candle flickered, and his shadow moved across the parchment. He thought of monks in their scriptoria, bent over manuscripts, drawing flourishes in margins. They too worked by candle. They too traced symbols not always required. Was their devotion different from his? He doubted it. Candlelight blurred the boundaries. The scribe's quill and the mason's compass both sought to bring order from darkness. Sometimes he lifted his compass to the flame, watching the metal glow faintly. It reminded him of the sun, the great circle burning in the sky. To hold a compass by candle was to hold a fragment of that light, a way of bringing celestial order into earthly form. He wondered if monks thought the same when they gilded their manuscripts, catching sunlight on the page. The Vatican feared these shapes, feared the compass as symbol of loyalty to something outside their control. But the Mason saw no division. His compass traced the same order he heard in Psalms, the same balance he saw in liturgy. He did not separate geometry from faith. To him, the compass was candlelight turned into line, devotion turned into form. In his lodge, other Masons gathered, also working by candle. They shared wine, bread, stories of families. Their compasses lay open on the tables, arcs drawn on scraps of parchment, notes exchanged in low voices. No plots, no conspiracies, just men seeking perfection in form. The candlelight softened their faces, casting them as both ordinary and luminous. The Vatican might call them secretive, but what they held secret was not rebellion. It was reverence, too fragile to expose. A boy once watched his father at the bench, candle flickering, compass turning. He asked why circles mattered so much. The Mason smiled, placed the compass in the boy's hand, and said, "Because they never end. And because when you trace them, you remember you are part of something that never ends." The boy nodded, not fully understanding, but he remembered the glow of candlelight, the calm of circles drawn in silence. Years later, when that boy grew into a Mason himself, he too worked by candle, compass in hand. He too felt the whisper of eternity in each arc. The chain of learning continued, quiet and unbroken, passed from light to light, circle to circle. The compass by candle reminds us that order is not owned by decree. It lives in shapes, in stars, in cycles. To draw it is not to infiltrate, but to listen. And in the silence of the night, with wax dripping and shadows dancing, the Mason's circles remained soft, steady, eternal. She sat by the window at dusk, her fingers moving over beads strung on a simple cord. At first glance, it looked like any rosary, each bead a reminder of prayer, each prayer a step toward devotion. But if one looked closer, the beads were not of polished stone or carved wood. They were dried seeds, tiny knots of nature, rose hips, juniper, lavender pods. Each bead was both prayer and plant, both symbol and remedy, she whispered as she touched each one. For peace. Her fingers pressed a lavender bead, its scent faint but steady. For strength. She touched a juniper berry, hardened with time. For healing. A rose hip, smooth under her thumb. Each bead carried both prayer and medicine, woven together into one chain. The herbal rosary was her way of blending worlds. She prayed as the church taught her, words repeated faithfully. But she also carried the memory of women before her who had strung seeds as charms, who had whispered to plants as to companions. She saw no contradiction. For her, God spoke through herbs as much as through scripture. At night, when called to a birth, she carried her rosary with her. The family saw her fingers moving, heard her prayers, and felt comfort. They did not always know that the beads themselves were medicine. A lavender bead crushed into tea, a rose hip steeped for strength, a juniper berry pressed against fevered skin. Prayer and remedy worked together, indistinguishable, seamless. The Vatican might have frowned at such blending, might have seen danger in herbs woven into devotion, but the people saw only care. They trusted the rosary because it looked familiar, and they trusted the herbs because they worked. Together they formed a bridge between fear and hope, between faith and healing. The woman remembered her grandmother's rosary, beads carved from wood but darkened with oils. She remembered her mother's version, strung with seeds and whispered over during long nights. Now she held her own, fingers tracing both lineage and prayer. Each generation added its own bead, its own prayer, its own herb. The chain lengthened across time, binding women together. A priest once saw her with it, noted its unusual texture, and asked gently. She replied simply, "It helps me remember to pray." He nodded, satisfied, and said nothing more. Perhaps he guessed its dual nature, perhaps not. Perhaps he, too, understood that devotion and remedy were not rivals, but companions. The herbal rosary became more than a tool. It was ritual. Each bead touched was a breath slowed, a thought calmed, a prayer anchored. The herbs, dried and fragile, reminded her that life too was fragile, yet resilient. The cord bound them together as community bound individuals. To hold the rosary was to hold both worlds in her palm. At times of fear, when whispers of heresy grew, she hid the rosary under her cloak. Yet she never abandoned it. At births, at deaths, at sickness, it remained with her, a lifeline of seeds and prayers. Its scent, faint and earthy, lingered even when hidden. A quiet assurance. The herbal rosary teaches that devotion need not be divided. Prayer and plant, faith and remedy, can live together. The Vatican may not have written it into liturgy, but the people lived it into being. Each bead, each prayer, each herb formed a circle of care that no fire could burn, no reprimand could silence. And so, as night fell, she moved her fingers bead by bead, whispering softly, her voice blending prayer with breath. Outside, the world turned, stars rising, the moon climbing. Inside, the rosary glowed faintly in her hand, a chain of healing and hope, unbroken across generations. The square was crowded with whispers. Mothers clutched their children closer, men shifted uneasily, and elders kept their eyes lowered to the cobblestones. At the center stood a woman, her hands bound loosely in front of her, a shawl draped over her shoulders. The crowd did not call her by her given name. That name had been taken away. In its place, they murmured the word the church feared and favored in equal measure: witch. To be called witch was to be stripped of self, reduced to a symbol of fear. To be called heretic was the same, though often reserved for men. These names carried weight heavier than chains, for they reached beyond the body into the soul. Once branded, escape was nearly impossible. The Vatican knew this. It wielded names like weapons sharper than swords. Yet behind each feared name was a story far more ordinary. The woman in the square had delivered infants with steady hands. She had brewed teas of chamomile and valerian. She had lit candles during storms and prayed for safe passage. But when a child fell ill and the prayers of priests failed, whispers grew. And when she healed where others had not, the whispers turned sharp. Names were born of envy as much as suspicion. The Masons, too, carried names given with suspicion. Brother, lodge member, Freemason. These words became loaded with meanings they did not always intend. To the Vatican, brother, outside the cloister was danger. Lodge was secrecy. Freemasons suggested allegiance to something greater than the church. Yet, to the Masons themselves, these words meant little more than fellowship, craft, trust. They did not hear conspiracy in them. They heard belonging. Names are fragile things, yet they hold enormous power. A blessing spoken over a child names them beloved. A reprimand written in ink names someone suspect. The same tongue that calls a woman healer one day can call her witch the next. The difference lies not in her actions, but in the fear or comfort others feel. The Vatican feared names it could not control, so it outlawed them, stamped them with condemnation. Witch, heretic, Mason. Yet banning a name does not erase the people behind it. It only forces them to live in shadow, carrying their true names silently while the false ones echo in public. Children, too, learned to fear names. They whispered them as warnings, using them to police each other. Don't talk to her, she's a witch. Don't trust him, he's a Mason. They grew up believing danger was in the word itself, never questioning what lay behind it. And yet, names fade. Time softens their sharpness. The woman once branded witch is remembered later as wise. The Mason once feared is remembered as builder. The heretic becomes saint in another century. The Vatican itself has renamed many through time, turning fear into reverence when the winds shifted. Names they feared remind us that power often lives in language, but so does resistance. For every false name imposed, there were quiet moments where true names endured, spoken in kitchens, written in margins, whispered in lullabies. The woman's daughter still called her mother. The Mason's apprentice still called him master. Beneath the imposed names, truth survived. What some called infiltration may have been nothing more than the persistence of true names beneath false ones. Titles rise and fall, accusations shift. But the essence of people remains, and in the long silence of history, the feared names lose their sting, leaving behind only the quiet dignity of those who carried them. In a drawer of a small convent, folded carefully between sheets of parchment, lay a list. At first glance, it seemed nothing more than scribbles of names and marks. But for the sisters who kept it, it was a map. A map not of roads or rivers, but of mercy. The list recorded who in the village was ill, who had given birth, who had lost a loved one, who had no bread to eat. Each line was a story. Anna, fever. Pietro, broken arm. Lucia, infant weak. Beside each name was another mark who had visited, who had brought food, who had prayed. The sisters did not call it a map, but that was what it was, a guide to where mercy was needed most. At night, they carried the list into their prayers. One sister whispered names aloud, another marked who would visit in the morning. Their rhythm was practical yet sacred. The Vatican did not forbid such work, but it did not record it either. For the Church, official records were baptisms, marriages, confessions, mercy, lived daily, often went unseen. Yet, without it, the faith itself would crumble. The map of mercy was not bound to women alone. In a Mason's lodge, a similar list lived, though less formal. Names of brothers injured, families in need, widows who required help. The Masons marked these quietly, ensuring bread was delivered, repairs were made, children were taught. Their fellowship extended beyond stone. Their map of mercy was carved in deeds rather than parchment. To outsiders, such care might look like secrecy, like networks operating beyond the Church's reach. But the truth was simpler. Mercy is not infiltration. Mercy is survival. People tend to one another because life demands it. The Vatican could not control mercy because mercy lives in hearts, not decrees. The map of mercy also crossed into healers' hands. Midwives kept mental lists of who carried unborn children, who suffered from bleeding, who feared childbirth after loss. Their maps were invisible, carried in memory, guiding them to knock on doors unasked. A loaf of bread, a pouch of herbs, a whispered prayer, they delivered these as surely as any priest delivered sacrament. The people trusted these maps more than edicts. A reprimand might arrive in the village, condemning a healer's practices, but when fever struck, it was the healer they sought. The map of mercy outlived the reprimand. Over time, these lists disappeared from parchment. The convent list grew faint, the ink faded. The mason's notes were lost to dust. The midwives' memory passed into stories. Yet mercy itself did not vanish. It resurfaced in new forms: nurses' charts, charities' records, hospitals' ledgers. The spirit of the map lived on. Mercy is a map because it guides us toward one another. It reminds us where suffering lies, where care is needed. It charts not territory but tenderness. The Vatican could fear symbols in stone or names whispered in secrecy, but it could never fully fear mercy. For mercy, once practiced, becomes too ordinary, too essential to ban. The map of mercy remains unwritten yet alive, guiding hands to doors, hearts to others, souls to solace. It is the true infrastructure beneath every society, invisible but indestructible. The scriptorium smelled of wax and parchment, of ink ground fresh before sunrise. Scribes sat bent over desks, quills scratching rhythmically as dawn crept through narrow windows. Their task was endless, copying psalms, letters, decrees. Day after day, they traced the same words, each stroke a repetition of faith. But dawn brought a different light. Before the abbot entered, before supervision sharpened, scribes allowed themselves small liberties. In the margins of sacred text, they drew tiny suns, circles, vines. Sometimes they slipped in symbols of their own lives, a bird they had seen, a flower from the cloister garden, even faces of brothers who had passed. These were not rebellions, they were whispers of humanity. One scribe, weary from hours of repetition, traced a compass faintly in the corner of a psalm. He had once watched masons work outside, admired the perfection of their arcs. To him the compass was no threat. It was beauty, symmetry, order, the same order he saw in Scripture. Another scribe, remembering herbs that had healed his mother, drew a sprig beside a prayer for mercy. These marks were small, almost invisible, yet they carried worlds within them. Dawn was the hour of freedom. Shadows lingered, supervision was light, and imagination stirred. The scribes did not intend conspiracy. They sought only to place themselves into the text, to leave a trace of their existence within eternity. A circle in the margin said, "I was here. I too sought meaning." The Vatican saw only the finished page, pristine words copied faithfully. Few noticed the symbols, and fewer cared. Yet centuries later, readers discovered them: tiny circles, faces, vines, animals. They puzzled over them, wondering if they were codes, if masons had infiltrated the scriptoria. Perhaps some were, but most were simple gestures of humanity, scribes weaving themselves into work that otherwise erased them. At dawn, when the first bell rang, supervision returned. The abbot walked the rows, eyes scanning pages. The scribes bent low, quills steady, faces calm. Their dawn whispers were hidden now, buried in margins, waiting for another age to notice. To write at dawn was to balance obedience with expression. The scribes carried both the duty to copy and the desire to create. In that tension, truth survived. Symbols passed into Scripture, unnoticed yet enduring. The scribes at dawn remind us that no work is entirely without self. Even in the strictest obedience, humanity seeps in through symbols, flourishes, small gestures. What the Vatican may have feared as infiltration was often nothing more than life asserting itself, refusing to be erased. And so, as dawn returns each day, we remember the scribes, their quiet hands, their small rebellions, their hidden art. In margins, they planted seeds that outlived them, whispering still, "Even in obedience there is room for wonder." Morning light streamed through glass as though heaven itself had melted into molten jewels. Red, blue, green, and gold fell across the cold stone floor, painting shifting rivers of light. The faithful who entered the cathedral looked upward, their faces glowing in colors not their own, eyes softened by the play of radiance. These were not just windows, they were sermons in glass. Each panel told a story. Prophets with raised hands, angels with trumpets, saints in quiet devotion. But hidden in corners, within the curling vines of ornament, small shapes lingered. A compass, faint but unmistakable. A star, subtly aligned with another in the heavens. A flower formed from 6 perfect petals, balanced as though drawn by geometry itself. To most eyes, these were decoration. To a few, they whispered more. The masons who built the frames and the glaziers who set the colors worked in harmony, one shaping stone, the other shaping light. They spoke a common language of pattern. For them, beauty was never just beauty. It was structure, order, proportion. The windows did not only tell stories of Scripture, they embodied truths of the universe itself, truths seen by anyone willing to look long enough. To the Vatican, the windows were triumph. Light itself bent to holy story. Yet they feared what might lie beneath, what symbols might have been slipped in without permission. Could a mason, loyal first to his craft, have placed his mark in the same space as saints? Did the glass carry messages not sanctioned by Rome? Such suspicions grew because color holds power. Light transformed by glass becomes impossible to ignore, impossible to silence. For the villagers who entered, the windows meant something simpler. They saw themselves reflected in color. Farmers felt warmth in golden panes. Mothers comfort in blues of Mary's robe. Children wonder in scarlet flames of Pentecost. They did not worry if a small star was geometric or symbolic. They felt only the awe of light becoming story. At night, when the church was empty, the windows stood silent, black mirrors reflecting only the candles. But by day, they awakened, revealing once more their hidden sermons. And each morning, the masons and glaziers who had built them could walk through and smile quietly, knowing their work lived beyond themselves. Whispers of infiltration often circled these windows. Were they coated with secrets, marked with signs of forbidden brotherhood? Perhaps some were, but more often, they were simply art shaped by men who lived in both faith and craft, unable to separate them. For to shape light is to shape spirit, and no decree can fully control that. The windows of color remain, centuries later, still glowing, still whispering. They remind us that truth does not live only in words. It lives in light, in color, in patterns hidden in beauty. And every time sunlight passes through, it carries with it a sermon older than suspicion. That beauty itself is sacred, and no one can own it. The cassock was long and heavy, its black fabric brushing against the floor as the priest walked. To the villagers, it meant authority, the presence of the church in their midst. Children lowered their eyes when it passed. Men removed their hats. Women bowed their heads slightly. The cassock carried weight, not only of fabric but of meaning. Yet beneath it walked a man, not so different from those who greeted him. He carried doubts, memories, aches in his knees. He remembered his mother's herbs as well as his father's prayers. He recalled nights when fever threatened his siblings, and it was not the priest but the midwife who saved them. Beneath the cassock, faith and memory intertwined in ways the church could not dictate. Sometimes he carried herbs in his pockets, lavender or thyme, tucked away not as rebellion but as remembrance. Sometimes he whispered blessings in Latin, other times in the words of his childhood, plain and tender. To the Vatican, his cassock symbolized obedience. To himself, it also carried the hidden threads of his own people. There were priests who sympathized with masons, respecting their craft. They spoke in quiet tones, acknowledging that geometry too revealed God's order. Some even listened to healers, knowing their remedies worked when prayers alone did not. They wore their cassocks outwardly as uniform, but beneath, their lives remained complex, woven with both sanctioned faith and forbidden respect. The Vatican feared this most. Not open rebellion, but quiet blending. A priest under cassock who carried both scripture and herb. A monk who copied psalms yet admired a mason's compass. A friar who preached obedience yet slipped coins to a woman accused of witchcraft. Authority wavered not in grand defiance but in small human gestures beneath the cassock. The people noticed. They saw when a priest lingered by a sickbed longer than expected, when his prayers softened into simple human comfort. They saw when he ignored whispers about healers, allowing them to continue their work. They knew that beneath the cassock was not an enemy, but another human, bound by vows yet still shaped by life. Suspicion called these men infiltrated, compromised. But perhaps they were simply whole. Perhaps wearing the cassock did not erase their humanity, their memory, their compassion. Perhaps beneath the black fabric lived men who understood that God's grace cannot be contained by decree. The cassock will always symbolize authority. But under it, there will always be flesh, fragile and tender, carrying truths larger than any uniform. The church may guard the cassock, but it cannot guard the heart that beats beneath it. And often, that heart whispers mercy where decree demands judgment, whispers compassion where law demands silence. The garden was enclosed by stone, its walls high enough to block the street, low enough for sunlight to pour over. Inside, herbs grew in neat rows: sage, thyme, rosemary, mint. The sisters tended them daily, hands in soil, habits brushing the leaves as they moved. To outsiders, the garden looked ordinary, another cloister plot. To those who worked within, it was sanctuary. The garden wall marked boundary. Outside lay suspicion, rumor, watchful eyes. Inside lay quiet growth, healing, freedom. The wall did not only hold stone, it held silence, protecting what was fragile. Within its embrace, knowledge survived. Here, sisters learned which herbs soothed fever, which calmed grief, which eased childbirth. They whispered to one another as they harvested, passing on memory older than their convent, older than the Vatican itself. Their wall was not to keep others out, but to give space for truth to breathe. The Masons who built such walls knew this. They shaped stone to create boundaries, to hold gardens, to give privacy. They understood that within walls, new life flourishes. Their work was not infiltration, but collaboration. Without walls, the gardens would wither under trampling feet. With walls, they thrived. The Vatican may have feared what happened within such gardens. Rumors of potions, whispers of forbidden rituals, stories of women mixing prayer with herb. But the truth was simpler. The garden was survival. When food ran low, the herbs flavored thin soup. When illness struck, the plants became medicine. When grief came, their fragrance became comfort. Children grew playing under the wall's shade, learning names of plants before letters. Elders sat in corners, breathing scents that reminded them of their youth. The garden wall became part of memory, part of rhythm, part of life itself. And yet, suspicion lingered. Why walls so high? Why herbs so carefully tended? Some said secrecy, others said safety. But perhaps the wall was only what it seemed: protection. In a world quick to condemn, even tenderness requires shelter. Centuries later, ruins of such walls still stand. Their gardens gone, their herbs faded, but their stones whisper of what once grew. They remind us that walls can confine, yes, but they can also protect. They can hide danger, or they can preserve life. It depends on what is planted within. The garden wall is not proof of infiltration. It is proof of resilience. Behind stone, truth grows quietly, waiting for the day when suspicion fades and the wall can fall, revealing what has always been: healing, ordinary and sacred, thriving in soil. The silence in the cathedral was heavier than stone. It pressed down from the vaulted ceiling, slipped into the aisles, and wrapped itself around every figure kneeling in prayer. Silence was not emptiness, it was presence, thick and alive, holding confessions never spoken aloud. The Vatican prized silence as obedience, as proof of reverence. But silence had many forms, and not all were theirs to command. There was the silence of the Mason, bent over his work, chisel tapping in rhythm but his lips closed. He carved patterns no one asked for, circles hidden in arches, stars faintly etched into capitals. His silence was a vow to his craft, to let stone speak where he could not. There was the silence of the midwife, her hands bloodied yet steady, whispering words no one else would hear. Her prayers stitched into the cries of newborns. Her silence was protection, for to speak too much was to invite danger. And then there was the silence of those accused, standing in squares while crowds murmured names like witch, heretic, Mason. They said nothing, for words would be twisted, used as evidence. Their silence was defiance, the only shield they had left. The Vatican feared silence it could not interpret. To them, unspoken words held more danger than shouted rebellion. A priest's pause in confession, a monk's hesitation in chant, a woman's refusal to answer all seemed laden with hidden meaning. They sought to fill silence with decree, with liturgy, with sound. Yet silence remained stubborn, always returning, heavier than their words. Silence is weight because it carries what cannot be spoken. Generations of knowledge tucked into breath, gestures, and glances. Mothers teaching daughters remedies without writing them down. Masons passing secrets through the feel of stone rather than words. Scribes marking circles so faint that only silence could carry their meaning forward. The people lived with this weight daily. They learned when to speak and when not to. They read silence in each other's eyes, knowing more in what was withheld than in what was said. The Vatican misunderstood this language, thinking it absence. But silence was presence, encoded and alive. In the convent gardens, sisters practiced silence, not as obedience, but as communion. They walked the paths wordless, hearing the bees, the wind, the creak of branches. In that silence, they touched something holy, not the silence of suppression, but of expansion. Silence as doorway, not prison. At night, the silence of the village was punctuated by whispers, prayers, lullabies. The rustle of herbs hung to dry. Yet underneath was a deeper quiet, the collective hush of people who carried truths too fragile for words. This silence weighed heavily, but it also protected. What is unsaid cannot be burned. What is unspoken cannot be silenced by decree. The weight of silence is paradox. It suffocates, but it also shelters. It isolates, but it also binds. It was this duality the Vatican never mastered. They could demand silence in confessionals, but they could not command the silence of kitchens and gardens, the silence of hands moving in rhythm with life. And so silence endures, heavier than suspicion, older than decree. It is the language of those who cannot speak, and yet through it, they say everything. Night fell, and the cathedral transformed. Candles flickered along the aisles, their flames trembling like small stars. But above, in the high vaults of the nave, something greater stirred. The masons who had designed the ceiling had aligned its ribs with constellations, mapping heaven into stone. By day, the faithful saw arches. By night, when moonlight pierced the high windows, they saw stars. The nave became a sky turned inside out, a firmament under which they walked. Each rib was not random but measured. Each boss where ribs met was not only decoration but point of reference. The masons knew the stars, their cycles, their meaning. They built the nave as mirror, so that when the faithful lifted their eyes, they lifted them into heaven's map. The Vatican saw this as devotion, the heavens glorified in architecture. But some whispered it was infiltration, masons smuggling astronomy into theology. They feared that geometry of stars rivaled scripture. Yet to the masons, there was no division. God wrote in scripture, yes, but he also wrote in stars. To ignore one was to ignore half his language. Villagers noticed in small ways. A boy lying on the nave floor, staring upward, said he saw Orion in the ceiling. An old woman whispered that the arch above the altar reminded her of the crescent moon. These were not conspiracies. They were recognitions, instinctive connections between heaven and earth. The masons carved suns into capitals, moons into bosses, stars into tracery. They did not do so to mock or rebel. They did so because they could not build without acknowledging the sky that guided their craft. The stars told them when to plant, when to harvest, when to travel, when to rest. They built those rhythms into stone, so that even in the cathedral, the people would not forget. At night, monks walking through the nave with candles sometimes paused, looking upward, feeling the weight of eternity pressed into the stones above. They knew Scripture spoke of stars set as signs in the heavens. To see them mirrored in arches felt less like infiltration and more like fulfillment. But fear has long shadow. The Vatican worried, if people saw stars in stone, would they trust Scripture less? If masons carved constellations, would they replace Christ with cosmos? Such fears misunderstood. For the faithful who walked the nave, the stars did not erase God. They magnified him, made his creation visible even indoors. Stars in the nave remind us that truth is not confined to words. It shines in the sky. It glows in glass. It rests in stone. Those who built understood this, and those who feared it perhaps feared wonder itself. In the bottom of a chest, beneath linens and scraps of parchment, lay a book. Its cover was plain, its pages worn. To most, it looked like an ordinary account ledger, filled with numbers of bread sold, grain purchased, wages paid. But to those who knew, it carried more. It was the hidden ledger. Written in careful hand, it recorded debts and payments, yes. But between the lines, in symbols and marks, it also recorded acts of mercy, gifts given, favors exchanged. A circle beside a name meant healing received. A star marked a midwife's visit. A triangle pointed to bread given without cost. It was a book of both economy and compassion. The Vatican recorded tithes and indulgences, precise and unyielding. But the hidden ledger recorded kindness that could not be taxed. It mapped the quiet network of care that sustained the village when decrees failed. The mason who could not pay his fee but carved a wall for a widow recorded. The healer who accepted eggs instead of coin recorded. The sister who gave herbs to a family too poor to buy them recorded. Each line whispered a story of survival. Suspicion grew because such ledgers bypassed church control. If the village could care for itself, what need had they of indulgences? If mercy could be measured outside tithe, what power had decree? And so whispers of infiltration grew. They said masons kept secret books, that healers recorded forbidden practices. In truth, they recorded life. They wrote what mattered when gold did not. Who helped, who gave, who endured. The hidden ledger was never meant to be rebellion. It was memory. Without it, kindness would vanish into air. With it, the village remembered. And in remembering, it grew strong. Centuries later, such ledgers are gone, their pages lost to dust. Yet their spirit lingers in charities, in mutual aid, in hands that reach out without cost. The hidden ledger lives on wherever acts of mercy escape accounting. It reminds us that life cannot be measured in coin alone. It must also be counted in care. The hidden ledger teaches that infiltration may not be subversion at all. It may simply be love, written quietly in margins, kept safe in hidden books, enduring long after suspicion fades. The fire burned low in the courtyard, its embers glowing with a dull red light. Pages curled and blackened, words dissolving into smoke that rose to the heavens. A clerk stood by with quill and parchment, recording what was destroyed. For the Vatican, burning a book was never enough. It had to be remembered that it had once existed, so that its absence could be justified. The villagers who watched from a distance smelled the char before they saw the glow. They recognized the scent, not just wood, but parchment, leather, ink. They knew what was burning: herbals, journals, almanacs, writings that spoke not of rebellion but of plants, stars, births, deaths. To the Vatican, these were dangerous. To the people, they were life. But even as the pages turned to ash, ink lived on. Scribes had copied recipes into margins of psalters. Children had memorized verses of remedies like rhymes. Masons had carved signs into stone where no fire could reach. Ash consumed parchment, but memory consumed ash. The knowledge shifted form, finding new places to hide. A midwife watched the fire in silence, her hand resting on her daughter's shoulder. She whispered, "What burns can still live," and she began to recite aloud the recipes that had been taken from her. She spoke slowly, carefully, making her daughter repeat them until they were lodged in memory. Ashes fell, but words rooted deeper. Ink itself became a paradox. It was both vulnerable and indestructible. A page could be burned, but a stroke carved into stone or a line pressed into memory could not. The Masons knew this. They called their carvings frozen ink. The sisters in the convent knew it too. They spoke of prayers carried not only in words but in patterns embroidered on cloth. The Vatican feared ink because it traveled. Words written could cross borders, slip into hands, inspire thought. Burning was meant to stop that journey. But ashes have a way of scattering. A fragment carried by wind might land in soil. A memory spoken in fear might survive longer than a book kept in safety. The people learned resilience from these fires. They learned to write smaller, to hide their books within thicker ones, to copy only what was essential. They learned to pass ink into song, into story, into gesture. Ash taught them to be subtle. Ink taught them to endure. The paradox of ashes and ink lies still. One destroys, the other preserves. Yet in their dance, truth survives. The Vatican could not stop ink from finding its way, even if they burned 1,000 books. For every page consumed, another was whispered, carved, or remembered. Ash rises, but ink roots. And in that balance, knowledge endures. In the cloister garden, a stone bench stood beneath an old tree. Its surface was worn smooth by generations of monks who had sat there in silence, their robes brushing against its edge, their prayers rising with the morning birds. The stone seemed ordinary, yet those who sat upon it swore it listened. A novice once wept there, confessing his fears aloud, though no one else was present. He felt lighter afterward, as if the stone had absorbed his sorrow. An elder monk, overhearing, only smiled. "The stone hears what we cannot," he said, "and it keeps silence better than we ever could." The idea spread quietly. The bench became a place of unspoken confessions, of whispered fears, of secret thoughts. Not because it truly heard, but because people believed it did. The stone became a companion, a witness that did not judge, did not speak. In its presence, burdens lifted. The masons who had carved it long ago might have smiled at this. They knew stone carries memory in its weight, its grooves, its weathering. They might not have expected that memory to be spiritual. Yet perhaps they understood. Stone holds presence. Cathedrals built of stone carry more than sound. They carry the echo of centuries of prayers. Each wall is thick, not only with mortar but with memory. The Vatican prized confessionals, wooden boxes where sins were spoken and forgiven. But the people trusted stones too. A wall, a bench, a floor beneath their knees. These did not absolve, but they absorbed. They gave silence when no priest could. Suspicion later whispered that Masons taught people to trust stone over scripture, to place faith in creation rather than church. Yet the truth was gentler. People trusted both. They prayed in pews, then sat on stones. They confessed to priests, then spoke softly to walls. They did not divide the sacred from the ordinary. They lived both. The listening stone was no rebellion. It was comfort. It was proof that creation itself can be companion. The same God who shaped heavens had also shaped stone. Why should stone not also hear? Centuries later, pilgrims still touch old stones, pressing their foreheads against walls, believing the stone listens. Perhaps it does, or perhaps we are the ones listening, hearing ourselves more clearly when silence surrounds us. The listening stone reminds us that infiltration is sometimes only imagination finding the sacred in what is already here. It is not threat, but tenderness, and in that tenderness, people survive. At dusk, the cloister filled with shadows. Long arches stretched across the square courtyard, each column throwing a twin across the tiled floor. The monks walked slowly, robes whispering, their sandals scuffing softly. To most, it was ordinary, the rhythm of evening prayer, the calm of transition, but to a few, the shadows themselves seemed alive. Children visiting whispered that the shadows looked like figures kneeling, bowing, sometimes even moving. Elders laughed softly but did not correct them. They too had felt the presence in the shadows. In the half-light, the cloister seemed to hold more than monks. It seemed to hold memory, as though generations of prayer had thickened into form. The Vatican valued light candles, gilding, brilliance in chapels, but shadows belonged to the cloister. They could not be commanded. They stretched and bent, made shapes unplanned, lingered where light could not reach. Suspicion whispered that Masons carved cloisters to invite shadows, to create spaces of secrecy. Perhaps they did. But perhaps shadows are inevitable when arches rise. Perhaps the Masons only shaped what nature already promised. Interplay of light and dark. The monks did not fear shadows. They walked among them daily, letting them lengthen with evening, shorten with dawn. Shadows taught them rhythm, the balance between seen and unseen. They knew scripture spoke of light overcoming darkness, but they also knew shadows were not absence. They were evidence of light, proof it had touched matter. In time, villagers spoke of cloister shadows as omens. A long shadow at a certain angle meant harvest would be good. A shadow that lingered too long meant illness might come. These beliefs were not rebellion but reflection. The people saw patterns where patterns lived. They read shadows as others read stars. Suspicion again called this infiltration, a mixing of superstition with sacred. But for those who walked the cloister, it was simply life. Shadows are companions. They remind us of presence, of passing time, of light's constant return. When the last bell of evening rang, shadows deepened until they became indistinguishable from night. The monks returned to their cells, carrying the memory of their walk. The cloister fell silent, but the shadows remained, stretching across stone as if keeping vigil. The cloister shadows teach us that truth is not only in brilliance, it is also in shade, in silence, in forms that flicker and fade. They remind us that suspicion often fears what is natural, what cannot be controlled. And they whisper still, across centuries of stone. Even in shadow, there is peace. The marble was cold when first cut, quarried from mountains where wind sang through ravines. Men with chisels and hammers coaxed blocks from rock faces, their hands blistered, their backs bent. To them, marble was not just stone. It was promise. Veins ran through it like rivers beneath ice, subtle lines of color that carried stories of Earth's age. When the blocks reached the cathedral, masons studied the veins carefully. They turned each piece, aligning lines so that one flowed into another. To the casual eye, it was only decoration. To the mason, it was harmony, a quiet order hidden in stone. He knew the Vatican saw marble as grandeur, proof of wealth and divine authority, but he saw veins as maps, lines whispering of time before bishops, time before Rome itself. A priest once asked him why he took so long placing a single slab. The mason replied softly, "Because the stone already speaks. My work is to listen." The priest nodded, half understanding, then walked away. But the mason lingered, tracing the veins with his finger, letting his compass guide alignment. Villagers who entered the cathedral often touched the marble walls. Cool, smooth, veined with faint reds, grays, and greens. They did not know the effort behind each placement, yet they felt the calm. The veins drew their eyes along paths, like rivers carrying them deeper into silence. Whispers grew that masons encoded messages in marble, that veins aligned with hidden symbols. Perhaps some did, but often the veins needed no intervention. Nature itself had carved them. The mason simply revealed what was already there. If meaning was seen, it was because the earth had written it. The Vatican feared this quiet revelation that creation itself carried its own scripture, not needing ink or decree. The veins of marble reminded people that the earth was older than institutions, wiser than suspicion. Each line was a verse, written not in Latin but in mineral, untranslatable yet undeniable. As centuries passed, the marble endured. Its veins darkened, softened, shifted with light. People still touched it, still felt the cool calm, still followed lines with their eyes. The veins remained what they had always been, silent testimony of time, carrying within them a truth no authority could erase. The veins of marble teach us that beauty is not imposed but revealed. The mason listens, the stone speaks, the world continues. And beneath suspicion of infiltration, beneath grandeur of decree, the veins remain patient, eternal, whispering still. In the echoing halls of the Vatican, a man walked slowly, keys jangling at his side. Dozens of them, iron and bronze, each one heavy with purpose. He knew which key fit which door: archives, chambers, cellars, cloisters. To most, he was invisible, a servant, moving silently. But to those who understood, he was power itself. For what good is authority without access? He did not write decrees. He did not preach sermons. Yet without him, the words and rituals remained locked away. He was the keeper of keys. Each night, when the doors were closed, he lingered, testing locks, listening for the hollow click that meant safety. His life was routine, yet he knew secrets no bishop could imagine. For behind certain doors lay rooms rarely seen. Shelves stacked with manuscripts too fragile for public eyes, chests of letters sealed and forgotten, Cabinets of herbs gathered as curiosities, though condemned in practice. The keeper walked among them often. Alone, candle in hand, he read what he could, touched what he dared, listening to silence that weighed heavier than gold. The Vatican trusted him because they had to, but trust was never complete. Whispers said keepers of keys sometimes copied what they saw, passing it beyond the walls. Some said Masons sought their friendship, midwives bribed them, scribes leaned close with requests. Perhaps some of it was true, for what man holds keys without also holding temptation? Yet often, the keeper's loyalty was not to faction or secret lodge. It was to knowledge itself. He felt awe when he touched ancient pages, when he unlocked doors hiding treasures of thought. He could not help but believe these things were meant to be remembered, not buried. He carried his own small ledger, hidden beneath his bed. In it he noted what each key opened, what he had seen, what he had felt. He did not share it, but he knew it was dangerous. Still, he wrote, for silence weighed heavier than the ring at his waist. Villagers rarely saw him, yet they felt his presence. When archives opened unexpectedly, when a rumor of hidden text escaped, they guessed the keeper's hand. He was a shadow in the background, but shadows often carry more truth than light. The Vatican may have feared Masons, healers, scribes, but perhaps the greater power lay in the man who unlocked their doors. He alone decided who entered, who remained outside, what was revealed, what stayed hidden. His keys were iron, but their weight was eternal. The Keeper of Keys teaches us that infiltration may not come from lodges or herbs. It may come from the quiet man trusted too much, ignored too often, who carried within him the greatest access of all. In a small attic above a weaver's shop, a loom stood silent. Its threads stretched taut, waiting for hands. Each morning, the weaver sat, passing shuttle back and forth, weaving cloth for cloaks, linens for tables, habits for sisters. To most, her work was simple trade, but in her mind, each thread was more. She whispered prayers as she worked, weaving them into the fabric. A blessing for strength in the warp, a prayer for peace in the weft. The cloth held both, invisible yet present. Those who wore it felt comfort without knowing why. Her grandmother had done the same, her mother too. Each taught her not just how to weave, but how to bind intention into thread. This knowledge never appeared in books, for books could be burned. It passed hand to hand, word to ear, thread to thread. The Vatican spoke of vestments as sacred, garments infused with prayer. But the weaver knew any cloth could be holy if woven with care. A child's blanket, a widow's shawl, a worker's cloak, all could carry blessing. She needed no permission to sanctify. Her loom was altar enough. Suspicion grew around such practices. People whispered that healers wove charms into cloth, that Masons carried symbols stitched into their garments. The Vatican feared these unrecorded prayers, fearing they rivaled its sacraments. Yet the people trusted them. They wrapped themselves in the weaver's work, feeling unseen strength. The unbroken thread stretched across generations. Each weaver passed it on, not as object but as practice. Even when one died, another continued. Even when suspicion burned, another whispered. Thread endured where parchment failed. One evening, the weaver wove a single red thread through a plain cloak. It was barely visible, hidden in folds. But to her, it was a symbol. Life flowing, never ending, resilient. The wearer never knew, but the blessing remained. Centuries later, fragments of such cloth still surface. Shawls worn thin, habits faded, yet threads intact. Scholars debate their meaning. Were they charms? Were they rebellion? Perhaps. But perhaps they were only love, woven daily, unbroken across time. The unbroken thread teaches us that truth need not be shouted, written, or carved. It can be whispered into fabric, carried close to skin, passed from hand to hand, generation to generation. Suspicion cannot sever it. Fire cannot burn it. For the thread is not cloth alone. It is memory, connection, resilience. And it remains unbroken still. The crypt was colder than the church above. Its walls held moisture, Its air smelled of stone and time. Torches flickered, their light glancing across carved tombs, inscriptions fading into shadow. The faithful rarely came here, except on feast days when relics were shown. Yet the crypt had its own congregation, silence, bones, and echoes. Every step down the narrow stair carried sound that multiplied. Sandals scuffed, coughs lingered. Whispered prayers seemed louder than spoken ones. Monks who came to keep vigil knew that the crypt itself seemed to answer them. They said it was the echo of souls, a chorus of the departed still praying alongside the living. The Vatican called crypts places of memory, solemn reminders of mortality. But to the Masons who built them, they were also lessons in sound. Each arch, each curve was placed to carry resonance. The echo was not accident, it was design. A chisel here, a curve there. And suddenly a whisper became a chorus. Suspicion later asked if Masons used crypts for secret gatherings, their voices disguised by echoes. Perhaps some did. But for most, the echo was not conspiracy. It was wonder. Villagers who ventured down sometimes felt afraid. They crossed themselves quickly, whispering to saints entombed in niches. Yet some also felt comfort. To hear one's own prayer returned, multiplied, was to feel less alone. The crypt made the smallest voice sound eternal. Stories grew around this. A widow swore she heard her husband's voice answer when she prayed in the crypt. A novice claimed a chant continued after he stopped singing. These tales traveled, mingling fear with awe. The Vatican sometimes warned against superstition, but it could not deny the crypt's power. For even priests felt it when they walked there, the sense that walls listened, that stone itself remembered. Masons left small marks in crypt stones, simple lines cut into corners where no one looked. Were they signatures or messages? The Vatican feared the latter. But perhaps they were simply reminders. I built this. I was here. Marks like echoes in stone. Carried forward into centuries, at night, when candles burned low and silence deepened, the crypt was most alive. Echoes lingered long after footsteps had gone, as if the walls themselves continued the prayers of those who had passed. To some, this was frightening. To others, it was holy. The echoes in the crypt remind us that sound does not vanish. It lingers, transformed by stone, carried beyond its moment. Suspicion may call it infiltration, but perhaps it is only memory, the stone holding voices as tenderly as it holds bones. Behind a locked wooden door in a monastery, a small room held shelves of jars. Inside each jar were dried leaves, flowers, roots. Neatly labeled, carefully arranged, they formed a collection more dangerous than weapons. This was the herbarium. Officially, it was meant for study plants recorded for curiosity, their forms pressed into parchment, their names written in Latin. But in truth, it was more than study. The monks knew these plants healed. They steeped them in teas, ground them into powders, mixed them into salves. For every prayer they offered, they also prepared remedies. The Vatican permitted certain herbs, wine for sacrament, incense for liturgy, but too many plants were deemed suspect. Mugwort for dreams, mandrake for childbirth, willow for pain. To use them was to step into shadow, to risk accusation. And yet, the herbarium grew. Monks tended it in silence, keeping lamps low. They wrote notes in careful script, sometimes disguising remedies as metaphors. A plant that eased fever might be described as cooling the fire of the soul. A root that dulled pain might be called quieting the cry of the body. Those who read with eyes of need understood. Those who read with suspicion saw only pious poetry. The herbarium's jars were not only local. Some came from far lands brought by travelers, traded in markets, carried along pilgrim routes. Cinnamon, cardamom, saffron, aloe. Each new jar widened the map of knowledge, a quiet testimony that healing knew no borders. Whispers spread. Masons and midwives sought herbs here. Priests exchanged jars in secret. Was this infiltration? The Vatican feared so, but perhaps it was simply mercy. For when a child burned with fever, the monk reached for willow bark, not only prayer. And when a woman labored in pain, the midwife reached for herbs, not only rosaries. Villagers knew whom to ask. A quiet knock on the monastery door, a whispered plea. The herbarium door opened, a jar exchanged hands. Payment was not coin, but gratitude. The Vatican might have condemned it, but the people saw life saved, pain eased, hope restored. Centuries later, some of these jars still exist, their contents faded but intact. Scholars study them now, amazed at their accuracy, their reach, their quiet persistence. They call it science. But to those who lived then, it was survival. The Forbidden Herbarium teaches that knowledge cannot be destroyed by decree. It hides in jars, in gardens, in memory. Suspicion called it infiltration. Mercy called it healing. And mercy, always, outlives fear. Night cloaked the village, but in windows and doorways, small lights flickered. Lanterns, their glass panes clouded, their flames steady. They were more than light. They were vigil. Each lantern told a story. One burned by a bed where a child coughed through the night. Another glowed in a barn where animals birthed. Another shone in a cottage where a woman prayed for her husband at sea. The lanterns marked presence, endurance, hope. They were promises to keep watch, to not surrender to darkness. The Vatican valued vigil, 2 candles burning before altars, flames kept alive in chapels. But the village lanterns were different. They burned in ordinary rooms, on humble tables, on thresholds swept daily. They sanctified the ordinary. Masons often built the lantern niches into walls, small hollows to hold light safe from wind. They knew the importance of flame. Without it, work ended, fear grew, night deepened. With it, life continued. The lantern was not luxury. It was necessity. Whispers grew that lanterns signaled secret meetings, that certain patterns of light meant Masons gathered, or healers worked. Perhaps some used them that way. But mostly, lanterns were love. A flame left burning for a sun returning late. A light carried to a neighbor's door in sickness. A glow that told the village, we are awake, we are here. On nights of plague, lanterns multiplied. Each house lit one, flames trembling in unison, like stars fallen to earth. To outsiders, it might have looked like ritual. To the villagers, it was solidarity. Each flame said, you are not alone. The Vatican sometimes frowned, fearing superstition. But no decree could extinguish so many small flames. Lanterns did not rebel. They endured. They carried warmth through night until dawn returned. Centuries later, lanterns still burn in vigils, candles held in hands at gatherings, lights placed on windowsills in memory. Their meaning remains. Presence, endurance, hope. Suspicion may call them infiltration, symbols of secret orders. But to those who lit them, they were only love made visible. Lanterns of vigil remind us that the smallest flame carries strength greater than fear, and together, they shine brighter than any decree could dim. The church was never truly silent. Even at night, when the doors were barred and the nave lay empty, the stones seemed to hum with remembered prayers. But the most powerful prayers were not the ones sung in chorus under vaulted ceilings. They were the ones whispered. Psalms breathed softly in corners, half-voiced, almost secret, yet heavy with devotion. Monks chanted aloud at dawn, their voices rising in unison. But in the quiet of night, individuals murmured psalms for themselves. Their voices trembled into the air like threads of incense smoke, curling unseen, carrying both fear and hope. These whispers were not rehearsed. They were not for ceremony. They were raw, personal, intimate. A farmer, kneeling in the back pew, whispered psalms with cracked lips, his voice shaking after a season of failed harvest. A widow pressed her forehead to cold stone, repeating words she barely understood. But knowing the rhythm soothed her grief. A novice monk, afraid of doubt, whispered verses into the folds of his habit, praying no one heard his desperation. The Vatican prized psalms sung aloud, their power magnified in harmony. But the whispered psalms troubled them, too private, too unregulated. What if the faithful added their own words between the verses? What if whispers became charms, prayers for rain, for healing, for things not sanctioned? Suspicion grew. Were these whispers holy or heretical? Were the faithful praying to God or to something else? But perhaps the truth was simpler. The whispered psalms were the soul speaking in its most natural voice, low, trembling, fragile. Not infiltration, but survival. Masons, too, carried psalms, humming them softly while carving stone, their voices almost drowned by the chisel's strike. Midwives sang them in quiet tones, as mothers labored, not as doctrine but as comfort. These whispers stitched psalms into daily life, making sacred what the church tried to contain within walls. Villagers began to associate certain psalms with certain needs, one for safe childbirth, one for protection on journeys, one for healing the sick. They whispered them as they worked, as they sewed, as they waited for dawn. The psalms slipped out of liturgy and into breath itself. Suspicion could not extinguish such whispers. They were too small, too ordinary. A whispered psalm leaves no record, no text to burn. It disappears as soon as it is spoken, yet its echo lingers in the heart. In that way, it is both fragile and eternal. Whispered psalms teach us that the sacred does not need to be loud. It does not need to be sanctioned. It survives in breath, in murmur, in the quiet persistence of those who will not stop praying even when words must be hidden. Every monastery had a gate, and every gate had a watcher. His job was simple: to open and close, to admit or refuse. But the watcher knew his task was not just physical. It was spiritual. He stood between worlds inside and outside, sacred and ordinary, seen and unseen. He carried keys, but more importantly, he carried judgment. A beggar came, and he decided whether bread would be given. A traveler arrived, and he judged whether the door would open. A woman whispered she needed herbs from the infirmary, and he weighed whether compassion or decree would rule his answer. The watcher's choices were never recorded, but they shaped lives. The Vatican spoke of gates as symbols of protection, fortresses against corruption. But villagers knew the gate also decided whether mercy was close or distant. They prayed the watcher would be kind. Suspicion grew around watchers because they saw too much. They knew who slipped in after curfew, who whispered at doors, who carried jars or books. Some said Masons befriended them, bribed them, shared secrets. Perhaps sometimes. But more often, watchers simply bore witness. Their eyes saw what could not be erased, even if their mouths remained shut. One watcher, weary with years, kept a small ledger hidden under his cot. He wrote not names but symbols. A star for a healer who came at night, a circle for a mason who left before dawn, a cross for a beggar turned away. He did not share it. It was his memory, his way of carrying weight too heavy for silence. The villagers respected him, though they rarely spoke to him. His face was the first they saw, the last before leaving. They read his eyes like scripture, knowing whether mercy would be granted. He was both barrier and bridge. Sometimes he bent rules. A loaf passed through when no one watched. A sick child admitted, though women were barred. A book returned quietly instead of reported. His mercy was risk, but it was also truth. He knew the rules. He also knew the people. He lived between. The Vatican feared infiltration at gates, and perhaps they were right. For the gate was porous. No matter how heavy the lock, compassion always found a way through. And the watcher, standing at threshold, carried both suspicion and hope in his hands. The watcher at the gate teaches us that true power is not in walls, but in the one who decides when they open. Suspicion may call this infiltration, but perhaps it is only humanity, choosing mercy where decree demands denial. In the carpenter's shop, sawdust floated in sunbeams, the scent of pine and oak filling the air. Tools hung neatly on walls, chisels, planes, mallets. But on the workbench lay one tool more revered than the rest, the square. Simple, two arms joined at a right angle, it was the carpenter's compass of earth. With it, he measured, aligned, made true. To him, the square was not just tool but principle. It reminded him that every structure needed balance, every joint needed honesty. A beam cut crooked would fail. A box built askew would not hold. The square demanded integrity, both in wood and in man. The Vatican prized crosses, altars, relics. But the carpenter held the square as sacred, not because it defied faith, but because it embodied truth in matter. It was scripture written in timber. To live squarely was to live justly. To cut squarely was to serve both God and neighbor. Suspicion fell on the square because Masons too revered it. Alongside the compass, it became symbol of craft. of brotherhood, of hidden meaning. The Vatican feared such symbols, imagining conspiracies carved into wood and stone, but the carpenter simply built. He made tables for families, doors for cottages, coffins for the dead. His square guided his hand, nothing more. Yet symbols grow beyond intention. Children saw him lift the square, aligning beams, and whispered it was magical. Neighbors saw him draw perfect angles, and wondered what secrets he knew. Even he felt sometimes that the square carried wisdom older than his hands. When his son asked what made the tool holy, he replied, "Because it never lies." And the boy nodded, holding it reverently, sensing the weight of truth it carried. The square entered stories. People said masons hid messages in their use of it, that carpenters passed secret codes through its angles. But perhaps the real secret was simpler. Honesty endures. To build square is to build lasting. To live square is to live with integrity. The carpenter's square teaches us that not all symbols are infiltration. Some are simply truth, held in hand, passed through generations. Suspicion may turn it into code, but for those who use it daily, it remains what it has always been, a reminder that justice is measured, and truth, like wood, must always be cut straight. High in the belfry, where dust thickened on beams and pigeons nested in corners, hung a bell no one spoke of. Below, villagers knew the peal of the great bell that marked hours, feast days, and deaths. But this smaller one, darker in tone, was rung only at night, and only by hands trusted in silence. The secret bell had no inscription of saints, no gilded decoration. Its bronze was plain, almost crude, yet its voice carried deeper than the grand bell above. Its tone was not bright but heavy, resonant in the bones. Those who heard it in the stillness of midnight swore it was more felt than heard, a vibration threading through stone and marrow alike. Monks claimed it was rung to signal vigils, to wake those chosen for prayer at forbidden hours. Villagers whispered it warned of danger, fire, plague, soldiers on the road. Suspicion spread further still. That masons gathered by its summons, their meetings marked not by candle or parchment, but by the deep toll no outsider could mistake. The Vatican feared bells rung outside their decree. Sound was power, binding villages together, calling them to kneel, to feast, to mourn. A bell outside regulation was a voice outside control. So they demanded records. When was each bell rung? By whom? For what purpose? But the secret bell remained unlisted, its tolls unrecorded, its presence denied. A keeper of the belfry, old and nearly blind, knew its rope by touch. He spoke of it softly once to a novice, saying, "This bell rings for the forgotten. When no one prays, it prays. When no one watches, it watches." The novice never forgot. Years later, he too rose at midnight to pull the rope, letting the tone roll out into sleeping fields. Villagers claimed strange things happened on nights the bell rang. Some said they dreamed of ancestors speaking, of instructions whispered from beyond. Others said illnesses broke suddenly after weeks of suffering. Farmers said crops perked after the tone drifted across their fields. Was it truth, or was it hope shaped into story? Perhaps both. Centuries later, the great bells cracked, replaced, melted into new forms. But in dusty towers, secret bells sometimes remain. Their ropes frayed, their clappers rusted, yet their silence heavy with memory. To touch them is to feel centuries of midnight vigils pressed into metal. The secret bell teaches that sound carries beyond decree. It tolls not for control, but for care, for warning, for memory. Suspicion may call it infiltration, but perhaps it was simply love, cast in bronze, rung in darkness, keeping watch when all else slept. At the center of the village stood a well. Its stones were worn smooth by countless hands, its rope frayed by generations of use. Every morning, women gathered there with jars, drawing water, exchanging words, weaving gossip and prayer into the day's beginning. But the well held more than water. It held memory. Stories clung to its stones like moss. An elder once claimed her grandmother had seen stars reflected there the night before a great harvest. A young boy swore he heard voices rising from its depths. Lovers carved initials into its rim, long worn away, but their promise lingered. The well was not only source of thirst's relief, it was witness. The Vatican spoke of holy water, blessed and guarded in fonts within churches, but villagers often trusted the well's water more. They said it carried the blessing of the earth itself, filtered through soil, cooled by darkness. They drew it for baptisms as often as for bread, whispering prayers as they lowered their buckets. Suspicion grew because wells were also places of exchange. Healers met villagers there at dawn, slipping bundles of herbs into baskets under pretense of drawing water. Masons sketched plans in dust by its edge. Lines quickly erased when others approached. Midwives listened to whispered fears beside the well, their words hidden by the sound of rope creaking and buckets splashing. No decree could regulate such meetings. The well was too ordinary, too necessary. To ban it was to ban life itself. So suspicion grew louder instead, painting wells as places of superstition, of charms tossed into water, of rituals whispered under moonlight. Some of this was true. Coins sank, prayers followed, flowers floated on its surface. But were these rebellion, or simply hope clothed in gesture? Children loved the well most. They leaned over its edge, throwing pebbles, listening for the long, echoing splash. To them, it was magic proof the earth answered back. Elders, too, leaned close sometimes, murmuring names of the dead, waiting for the echo to carry them. Masons said every stone in the well carried stories. Each block held marks of hands long gone, their grooves recording centuries of touch. To rebuild such a well was to erase memory. So they guarded it fiercely, repairing cracks carefully, never replacing what could endure. Centuries later, wells still stand where villages have vanished, their stones silent but alive. Archaeologists dig them up, marveling at artifacts dropped within. But the truest treasure remains intangible. The memory of countless prayers and confessions poured into them like water. The wells of memory teach us that truth does not vanish. It sinks, rests, waits, carried in silence until someone draws it up again. Suspicion may call wells places of infiltration, but to those who lived, they were places of survival where thirst was quenched, and memory itself was drawn bucket by bucket, day after day.